Matthew Burks. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at eSource. I've spent about 20 years in the industry, and I came at it from the environmental side. My core interest was decarbonizing the grid and working to enable the future that we all need. And so the way that I wanted to have the biggest impact was working with utilities because of the scale issue, which we'll talk a lot about in this discussion. So by working with utilities and in utilities, we're able to have a much larger impact because of the nature of that industry. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer, which means that I spend the bulk of my time trying to steer eSource to where the puck is going to be, as opposed to where it is today. And the issues that we're facing and the things that we're going to talk about today are very complex, and so I spend a lot of my time sort of at the edge of the industry, as opposed to working on how the system works today. I'm thinking about where the grid is going to be in the future and how we get there. So I come at the industry traditionally from the demand side, and this is it's an important part of the equation, right? Because the utility industry tends to be very focused on engineering, and so you got a lot of engineers and finance people and sort of policy folks, and I come at it from the demand side. So how are people interacting with energy? Where do people intersect with the utility industry? And so, the best example of that is mobility today, and issues like where are electric vehicles going to pop up on the system, and what are the implications of charging infrastructure on the grid, and how we need to manage it in the future. So those are the types of, it extends into all of the critical issues across energy efficiency, mobility, and sort of how we think about, again, the grid of the future based on how people are gonna interact with that system. Yeah, so mobility is a big deal. It's the electrification of the transportation sector, and it's a big part of decarbonization, a big part of the national political discussion right now, and something that the utilities are having to adjust for and start planning for and actively thinking about, right? So if you think about the implications of switching from liquid fuel to electric fuel, it's a very complex and massive task that I think people underestimate how complex, not only how important it is, but how complex it's going to be. So yeah, it's everything from buses to light-duty passenger vehicles to ports, everything in between, and the requirements to enable that are significant. From the utility perspective, the grid evolution, the sort of requirements for evolving the grid to support fueling electric vehicles, it's significant. The grid as we know it today is going to be fundamentally different than the grid of the future, and one of the biggest elements is the switch from sort of a supply side view of the world, that you can essentially generate more electrons and just generate your way out of these issues. As we try and decarbonize the grid at the same time that we switch over fuels to electric fuels, suddenly the grid edge becomes much more important, right? So the action happens at the end of the system, right, where the demand is. And so what's happening today, and what mobility represents, is that inversion from sort of a supply-centric worldview to a more demand-centric approach to managing the grid. and the implications of managing and supporting that infrastructure out at the grid edge is a big change from the way that things are traditionally done today. Today there are generally large sources, they large energy users that they can plan on. The grid is less dynamic than it will be in the future, so you can imagine inputs happening, the give and take of energy happening at the grid edge at tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of points in a distribution system. And the ability to sort of manage those assets, it's very different than the way things are done today. So the grid edge is literally out sort of at where energy is used, right? So it's houses, it's cars, it's battery systems that are sort of giving and taking energy at the end of the system, and solar panels, right? All of these things are systems that operate at the grid edge, and they're going to need to be managed. And so the big shift that's happening today, right? One of the big elements, which we talk about all the time, is we need to have visibility on those assets, right? So if you're just focused on the supply side, there's a set of data and there's a set of considerations that you have to take into account. When you start moving assets to the grid edge, you need to have eyes on those systems, right? You need to better understand what's happening in your distribution system. And it's not a small task, right? It's a very complex system. The grid is one of the most complex sort of engineering feats in human history. It's an amazing machine, and it's only going to get more complex as we move into the future. So when you think about cars charging, out at the end of the system, right, from transmission lines to distribution lines down to the individual circuits, right? As you get to the end of the system, there are going to be all of these assets and inputs that the utility is going to need to manage in one way or another. They're going to have to understand what's going on. Electric vehicle loads represent, pick your number, somewhere between, a half to 2/3 of a common house. Utilities are going through a fundamental shift right now. They are mandated to provide reliable, low-cost power and do so in a safe manner. What they're starting to deal with are a whole new set of challenges that are popping up at the same time, which make doing that difficult, right? So let's think about environmental sustainability. That's dealing with things like decarbonization. That's dealing with wildfires. That's dealing with extreme weather events, right? All of these things are starting to hit the industry at the same time. We have technological advancements, so think EVs, think distributed energy resources like batteries at the grid edge. Those are all hitting at the same time. And then we also need, as an industry, to deal with the issue of equity. And all of these factors are hitting at the same time. And the only way, in my opinion, to address many of these challenges is actually working across industries and working together to solve these problems, because there's no one industry that can deal with them or solve them by themselves. So let's think about electric vehicles, right? So electric vehicles are going to have a major impact on the system. You have automakers that think globally. You have utilities that think locally. They're locally focused on their specific service territory. And then you have groups like broadband providers and the communications industry, right? Well, what's really interesting about those industries is they traditionally don't overlap very much. They don't work together. We're now in a position where, in order to provide low-cost power, reliable power, in order to address the challenges that we have from climate change and from these technological advancements, we need to figure out how to work together, and we need to be able to share data across industries and share insights and predict into the future what's going to happen and start planning for that reality, right? So it's a very different and somewhat uncomfortable future for us in a lot of different ways, but it's a very exciting one at the same time. And the data that is spinning off of organizations like GridMetrics give us insight into the system from a secondary view, and potentially with additional value that may not even be there today from, even from the utilities. It's a different view on the world. It's another set of eyes on a system that is evolving in a very dynamic environment that's fundamentally different than anything that we've dealt with over the last 100+ years as an industry. So what's really interesting to me about GridMetrics, there are several factors. One is they're not constrained by the service territory. So in my world, we deal with utilities, and we help them plan and gather their data and make sense of their data, make decisions off of their data, but it's very focused on their service territory or their region. One of the unique attributes that GridMetrics brings to the table is we're not constrained by that, right? So we have a national view, we have a state view, we have a regional view, so we can look at these challenges in a more holistic way, which is really interesting. One of the other elements is temporal, right? So depending on the data source that you're getting, sometimes the data will come in, in different intervals of time, and where we need to get to, coming back to the need for visibility at the grid edge, right, is having good detailed data that is coming in live, right? And today, some of that data comes in bursts, but where we're going to and where we need to get to are data streams that are coming in almost constantly, right? And being able to monitor the grid as if it's a living organism as opposed to a snapshot in time, right? So that's a fundamental difference with the way that the telecommunications industry, broadband, sort of what they can bring to the table, what GridMetrics brings to the table. It's fundamentally different than the way that things operate today. So a really interesting element to this, right, is when you think about the intersection between the electric grid and the communications grid. If you look at transmission lines today, there's a cable that runs along the transmission system, and it's fiber, right? And the reason that it's fiber is because you need millisecond response, right? You need to understand what is going on in that system at all times, right? And you need that real-time visibility. And fiber enables that, right? As we move more critical assets to the grid edge, think large battery systems, think, virtual power plants, aggregated electric vehicle charging, aggregating home battery systems, those types of things. They become significant assets that need to be managed in a similar way. If they're going to provide grid support, you have to have millisecond response time on batteries. There are some applications where we can get away with, with cellular connections or Wi-Fi connections, but the reality is, in the future, we're going to need to have fiber connections to those assets. And when we come back to that cost issue that I was talking about before, you can't necessarily do both. And there are lots of different types of utilities that have different needs, but the reality is you're duplicating something that exists today that is ready to go today. And that's the opportunity. That's where the intersectionality happens to provide that visibility that we have on the transmission system, down on the medium voltage system, and all the way down potentially to the grid edge. So think of, again, EV chargers and battery systems and those types of assets. So I come at this challenge from the consumer's point of view. What I'm seeing a lot in the industry are organizations, for example, they traditionally, they have a large warehouse, right? That warehouse doesn't use a lot of energy. Suddenly, that warehouse wants to put solar on their roof. They also want to electrify their fleet of trucks. And they want to be able to charge those trucks off of the solar panels to enable their environmental mandates, right, for their own company. To enable that, right? And you start digging in on how does that actually happen? Well, you need to be able to understand in real time how much power that asset is generating, what's available to the grid at any time, so that if the grid needs additional electrons, that you can call on that resource, whether it be the solar panels or the battery system that's backing up the chargers, that you can adjust the charging schedule to sort of meet the dynamic needs of the grid. That's the use case where you need real-time eyes on these assets, and you need to be thinking about how does that actually happen at scale. And scale, it's not any one customer, right? It's that use case times 100, times 1,000, times 10,000. And people are underestimating right now, in my opinion. They're underestimating the complexity of pulling this off. There are a lot of pundits who have great ideas, but the one thing that they lack is the sense of scale, which is what utilities do. And it's what broadband providers do every day. They don't just enable a technology at a single house. They enable society to function by providing electrons and communication networks that basically enable society to function. So our industries understand scale in a way that others do not. So the transmission system is sort of well monitored and run. That's an important part of our national energy infrastructure. The utilities have good eyes on end use, right? So they can bill customers. They have advanced metering infrastructure. They have the communication networks to support that infrastructure that will be updated over time. There is currently this missing link in between that it's not all utilities have this problem, but there are many that do, where there's a gap there between the home and the sort of high voltage system, between the home and the substation, right? Where there's often a dearth of information and a dearth of visibility that we need to address. Again, as more DERs, more distributed energy resources get put onto the system. So the question is, how do we do that in a cost-effective way? One path is for utilities to build out, networks that are identical to what exists today. Another path, which I would argue is potentially more beneficial to all, is leveraging partnerships with the broadband industry to sort of leverage the networks that exist today and repurpose them for the needs that we have in the future. So there's a significant gap in our industry, which is the gap of information between the transmission system, which is sort of well monitored and well managed, And the utilities have a good view on the end use, right? For billing purposes and for energy management purposes. They have advanced meters at people's homes. They have a good view there. There is a gap between the home and the substation, for example. And one of the opportunities that I see is that's a gap that Grid Metrics is able to get eyes on, right? And the utilities, when we think about the challenges that they have in terms of doing this in a cost-effective way, they could go out and build a parallel network to that. And there's some utilities that they may decide to do that. But I would argue, again, thinking about the issue of scale and cost, that it's worthy of discussion, of partnerships between the industries, of collaboration between the industries to use the existing network that is there today and repurpose it and the capabilities that the broadband industry has to solve the challenges of the future. We're dealing with a very complex operating environment, right? So when you come back to the issues that I discussed at the beginning, right? Reliability, resiliency, security, equity, all of these things are the same issues that the broadband industry deals with, and I would argue has already dealt with in the past. The utility industry is going through a transformation that you could easily argue the broadband industry already went through 20 years ago, right? There are different folks who argue that point, but how close the parallels are. But the reality is, I don't think anyone argues that there isn't a strong parallel there. Customers are going to be they are today generating their own electrons through solar, wind, various mechanisms. They're storing that energy, and they're wanting to participate in the market, right? So we're getting to a place where electrons are going to get pushed back onto the system. This is eerily similar to what the broadband industry went through 20 years ago regarding data, right? And regarding information and how it was moved. So we're seeing one of the things that Grid Metrics enables and the broadband industry enables more broadly, right, is it empowers that transition, right? It is the infrastructure that we need to allow the same transformation to happen in our industry that the broadband industry went through 20 years ago. Grid Metrics is the aggregator of the broadband industry, from my perspective, right? They are able to go out and aggregate all of the data from these different organizations, again, who operate at scale, and they're able to pull that information together, curate it, and provide access to that data so that companies like utilities and others can understand what's happening nationally, what's happening at a state level, what's happening at a local level, again, through a secondary set of data that provides significant value because it's both a secondary source of data, but it's also highly secure. They've been tested, right? This is not a new world for them. So they are capturing and aggregating data in a way that almost no one else can possibly do in the U.S. and potentially globally. So when we think about mobility, right, and we think about the challenges that we need to take on, data is a significant component of that, right? There are certain data that utilities may or may not want to share. There's data that the OEMs, the auto manufacturers, may or may not want to share, and there's information that that the broadband cable industry may or may not want to share. One of the powerful elements of grid metrics to me is that they are able to provide a set of data in a uniform way that enables a consistent sort of entry point for all the parties to come together and have a consistent view of what a single version of the truth, right? That's not a small step forward. It's something that I think very few people understand and appreciate right now. And Grid Metrics is working hard to get the word out about the work that they're doing. But it is a significant step, and one that will force a lot of important conversations around how we think about data and how we potentially collaborate in the future. It's an exciting time, an exciting turn of events. So an important point to consider in all of this as well is the linkage between comms infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and then municipal city goals and objectives, right? So, and this can be extended out to state goals as well. But the reality is cities have different objectives, right? They are trying to balance the needs of a wide set of stakeholders, of their citizens, and sort of meet the challenge of the future that we face today. Grid Metrics has the potential to not only provide eyes on the energy system, right, on the electric grid, as well as the communications grid, but it has the potential to provide eyes to issues like pollution, or to noise pollution, or to weather, right? Wind speeds and all sorts of additional information, and that can be spinning off the system in real time. And so when you're operating and managing a city, right, again, the stakeholders, the number of people who need to be involved in these discussions and who could benefit from some of the information that could spin off of the comm system with that fiber backhaul. If we open our aperture a bit and we think about this in a broader context and what this means for contextualizing the data that we have and how we solve these problems, Grid Metrics has the potential to be a complete game changer in solving all these challenges. So being able to bring a whole new set of data to these challenges, think of something like equity, right? In the context of mobility, if you're able to think about and track where pollution is moving through a city center, you can make decisions around mobility and how do you think about electrifying buses or electrifying light-duty vehicles. You might make the decision that the benefit of electrifying light-duty electric vehicles in your city is significant from an equity perspective because there is a highway that runs through a low-income neighborhood which creates a lot of noise and creates a lot of pollution. One of the reasons that we continue to partner with Grid Metrics and have done so for more than 3 years is that Grid Metrics to me represents as a platform, right? And that platform has several capabilities, but the two most important is the ability to sense. So sensing within the sort of municipal ecosystem and even out into the rural areas as well. And then you have the backhaul, which allows you to get that data back to a central point securely, right? So one use, and the use that we talk about today, is energy, right? So having eyes on the utility electrical grid. But if you extend out the possibilities and you think about it in a more expansive way, open the aperture, you start realizing that that sensing capability can be extended into areas like sensing wildfires, which is another significant issue for us, right? You can sense smoke, and you can have an immediate call to action. You can see that in real time, and you can deal with that issue in real time. Another example would be how you see pollution move through a metro environment, and that can impact discussions around the equity aspects of transportation electrification, right? It allows you to look at noise pollution, right? What are the impacts across the metro area of silencing ICE engines, right? Or dealing with issues of large trucks moving freight between ports and storage areas, right, within low-income neighborhoods, right? So having those data, having access to those data on an ongoing basis, and viewing the municipal ecosystem as an ecosystem, and having data coming back in real time to really understand it in a more complete way and have eyes on that system is a game changer. And it's important, I think, that we just think about grid metrics in a broader context than just sort of how it's applied today, and think about where we could take this technology and all of the good that we could do with it. My aha moment with grid metrics was when the first time that I saw a storm roll through a service territory, and not just the service territory, but I was able to see their sensors going offline as it got to that point, right? So you could see the whole occurrence, the whole event unfold in real time as you watch that storm move up the East Coast. And there are plenty of examples, but having eyes on the full system as opposed to just one small part of it, and the potential power of that is significant. That was my biggest aha moment. I'm personally excited about it because of why I got into this business, which was to have an impact, right? And my goal has always been to sort of make the world a better place for my kids, and for my family, and for society at large. I've dedicated the last 25 years of my life to doing this kind of work and working on climate issues and on equity issues. So I'm excited about the possibilities of actually solving these big, hairy problems at scale. And Grid Metrics is a platform that gives me line of sight on how we can actually do that. One of the big areas, because I approach this from the demand side. I focus on, often a lot of my work is focused on the intersection between people and utilities, right? I think one of the things that's underappreciated is the scale of change that is going to occur. We're looking at a situation which is the shift from horse and buggy to combustion engines, and now we're making the shift from combustion engine to electric vehicles. The scale of this change cannot be overstated. We are going to see a shift because of human behavior and because of market forces, where in the coming decade, we're not going to see hundreds of cars. We're not going to see thousands of cars. We're talking tens of thousands of cars. We're talking hundreds of thousands of cars that all have the load equivalent to, pick your number, half a house, 3/4 of a house, it is a fundamental game changer, right? And we need to be planning proactively to address the challenges, to step up to that reality at scale. That's the thing that I think is most misunderstood right now when we hear pundits talking about it from a policy perspective or from a technology perspective or from a people perspective, is no one is addressing the issue of scale and how big a change this actually is. It's very easy to gloss over the details, but the reality is that there's an energy component to this. When you break it down, there's an energy component to this, there's a people component to this, and the only way you make it work is with the comms. And no one is talking about the comms. So this is the opportunity. This is the partnership that we're working on, why we're working so closely with GridMetrics, is we're trying to get ahead of this so that we can not only understand where we are today, but how we're going to cost effectively get to where we need to be in the future. The issues that we face are technological, they're behavioral, they are also dealing with environmental, and then we get into other issues that people tend to overlook in these discussions, and those are things like third-party actors dealing with security issues and attack surfaces that are at a scale, again, that we've never dealt with before. And my current thesis, my belief is that we have an industry partner here who has been dealing with this for multiple decades now. And so if we are going to actually enable the sort of comms element, the communications element to mobility and transportation electrification, we have to be working with partners who understand how to manage this and deal with this in a global context. And that includes security, and it includes low latency and reliable networks that can handle all of this transportation electrification at scale. So a big part of this challenge is we're not going to be able to generate our way out of this, right? We can't build more power plants because of carbon restrictions. We can have more solar facilities, we can have more batteries, but at the end of the day, we are going to have to move to a system where there's a more dynamic grid. That dynamic grid requires communications. And that is an issue that very few people actually understand and are talking about today. And so the opportunity, the excitement that I have around what GridMetrics is doing, and the reason why we continue to explore this issue and partner with GridMetrics, is that they provide a vehicle to solve that issue. They've got eyes on the system, and the broadband industry at large has the infrastructure that we need to cost effectively deal with the communications element at scale. So when I think about the challenges that utilities are facing today, particularly including municipal utilities, these are some of the largest cities in the United States. We have to understand these issues in a holistic way. And we have to be thinking about how to meet all the various demands that are put on our organizations to decarbonize at the same time we're providing low-cost power while we're upgrading the grid, an aging grid, while we're dealing with security issues, while we're dealing with resiliency issues from increasing climatic events, while we're dealing with equity. The list goes on and on and on. In order to do this, we need to have a more holistic view of how we solve these challenges. Again, no one industry, I think, is going to be able to deal with this. So we need to be working collaboratively. We need to have a set of data that enables us to not only look at the system in the rearview mirror. You can't drive a car while you're looking in the rearview mirror. We need to be getting data to enable us to look forward and plan for what the future is going to be, make predictions about where the grid is going to be, where demand is going to be on the system, and how we address those challenges. So that's what I'm advocating for with a lot of utilities. This is what I'm talking about in terms of the next generation of distribution planning, is making forecasts and making predictions, educated, data-driven predictions on what the future will hold. And the data that's available to us, it needs to be a broader set of data that's brought to the table, and that's the exciting thing for me related to grid metrics and the opportunities that we have with them. eSource's mission is to work with every utility in North America to do the hard work that they need to do to become a sustainable utility. And a sustainable utility represents all of the things that we're talking about today, and that includes being environmentally conscious. That means understanding equity, means being resilient and reliable, and from an economic perspective, making sure that the financials for the utilities keep costs low and allow them to do what they need to do into the future. In order to accomplish that goal, we need to think more holistically about our planning, and we need to think more holistically around the partnerships and how we do the work that we do. We have been in discussions with many partners around this idea of infrastructure convergence, right? And this is where the electric grid and the communications grid come together and overlap. To address the challenges that we have in the future, I spend a lot of time thinking about this, and eSource spends a lot of time thinking about how do we help our utility partners get to where they need to get in the future to support societal goals and to support their businesses. And there is an opportunity here for the utility industry and the broadband industry to partner. And to achieve the goals that we want to achieve, they are going to need to work together. So when I look out at the future, and eSource looks out at the future, we see a lot of challenges at scale. And when we think about the loads that are going to be coming online through EVs and batteries, there's going to need to be a shift in thinking on how we approach these issues. The partnership between utilities and potentially the broadband industry is potentially one of the most significant opportunities that we have, because the infrastructure already exists. And in order to meet that demand and reimagine the way that we operate today and do it at scale, do it cost effectively, and do it in a secure fashion as well, we need to have the two parties talking and collaborating and potentially working together. So this is one of the big things that I'm thinking about, and that we're thinking about it at eSource, is to get to where we need to get in the time frame that we need to get there. We need to start working together and collaborating between the two industries.